Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to take the opportunity to officially welcome all of you to Milton CAT this afternoon. My name's Bill Talley. I'm the Product Support and Sales Manager for New England. Again, appreciate you being here today. We've put together what we think is an important program and very timely based on following up on Sandy and the devastation. And it's only a couple months again till hurricane season, and I guess we can't quite count what's happening out there today as being that challenging. I wanted to take the opportunity to also mention we're looking for a speaker for the event, and we wanted to find someone that had some real first-hand experience. We certainly did here on the fringe within Milton CAT, but we reached out to one of our counterpart dealers, Foley Caterpillars, based in New Jersey, and they really bore the brunt of Sandy. So we reached out to my counterpart down there, Tom Domatorfi. Foley is the Caterpillar dealer that services northern New Jersey, basically. They're a company that's been in business for roughly 60 years. Very similar to a lot of CAT dealers. They're a privately held, family-owned business. And I guess without any further ado, I'd like to introduce my counterpart from there, Mr. Tom Domatorfi.
Thanks, sir. Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be here today. Thank you to my hosts. I must say I'm very impressed how they thought of every detail and even coordinated the weather and ominous forecast to match the theme of the event. Evidenced by the excellent turnout, emergency preparedness is an extremely important and relevant topic. Everyone in this room came with a common purpose: to gather information on the steps that need to be taken to plan, prepare, and execute in order to mitigate the risk and exposure during the next emergency. Some of you may have a lot of pieces of the equation put together. Some may be in the early stages of planning. By sharing with you my team's experiences and lessons learned before, during, and in the wakes of Hurricane Irene, and especially Superstorm Sandy, I hope that I expose each one of you to some thoughts, best practices, and challenges you may not have considered, and evoke in all of you a call to action to start your emergency preparedness plan today. 7 months have passed since Sandy impacted our territory. I would like to take you back 7 months with a short video so we can all remember the gravity, severity, and magnitude of the situation. It will add credence and cogency to the rest of the information I'm going to share with you.
This is actually the storm that's going to be merging with Hurricane Sandy to form the Frankenstorm.
Hurricane Sandy hammered the Bahamas early Friday after leaving 21 dead across the Caribbean. Some are calling it a superstorm. What is that all about?
As this storm moves farther north, it will expand. It's just really moving into a question of where.
This morning I formally declared a state of emergency in anticipation of Hurricane Sandy. We should not underestimate the impact of this storm, and we should not assume the predictions will be wrong.
The MTA has announced that they will start shutting down service. Subways starting at 7 tonight, buses at 9 tonight.
This is a serious and big storm.
If something looks like it's stupid to do, it is stupid. Staying on the Barrier Islands for 36 hours of hurricane force winds of 75 miles an hour or more, sustained, not gusting, is stupid.
Tens of thousands of people were ordered to evacuate coastal areas on Sunday from Maryland through Connecticut as Hurricane Sandy prepared to make landfall Monday or early Tuesday.
There's a shot of Atlantic City, New Jersey this morning as Hurricane Sandy is on her way. Stock and options markets are closed today. Thousands of flights have been canceled. Earnings reports are being delayed. And like I said, Sandy isn't even here yet.
The East Coast grinding to a halt as Hurricane Sandy prepares to make landfall.
This is a massive storm.
The most important message that I have for the public right now is please listen to what your state and local officials are saying. When they tell you to evacuate, you need to evacuate.
The East Coast reeling this morning as it absorbs the aftermath of Superstorm Sandy, where economic damages could be in the range of 10 to 20 billion. At least 30 people have been killed in 7 states. More than 8 million homes are without power. And in New York City, the wounds are particularly severe. In the borough of Queens, between 80 to 100 homes caught fire last night and were destroyed. Public transportation, meantime, continues to be closed after extensive flooding. There is no timeline on when that will change.
The level of devastation at the Jersey Shore is unthinkable.
What are the problems with trying to assess damage at this stage?
Well, there's 2 types of damage we're talking about here. One is property damage. So how much damage is there to people's homes, to office buildings, to roads, to the subway system that gets people to work.
Millions are still without power as the East Coast struggles to recover from Superstorm Sandy. At least 55 lives have been claimed so far in the U.S. Here in New York, Manhattan is beginning a difficult recovery process with paralyzed transportation services and power outages.
President Obama and New Jersey Governor Chris Christie surveyed storm damage across the Garden State.
When all of you look around and you see all this destruction, that's fine. But you know what? All that stuff can be replaced. You look to your right and to your left, to your husband or wife, your son or your daughter. Right? Those are the things that can't be replaced.
Got some really powerful images there that certainly bring back some memories for me of what it was like to live through that and the events during and after the storm. All said and done, the storm resulted in about $50 billion of damage. There were 8 million people without power. I don't know if that number is entirely accurate. I can't certainly claim to know 8 million people, but I know that all my family members, all my friends, all my business associates were all without power for some duration or other. That number also doesn't tell you how many businesses were without power, but certainly many of our customers were without power for days, weeks, some for even months. And I think it's the magnitude of this event that really exposed the vulnerability of so many customers. But I think it's important to keep in mind that statistically, a storm like this is pretty rare. Statistically, however, the chances of having a power outage at your facility due to various causes, equipment failure, a localized event, power outage, is far greater. And those events are not going to have the advanced warning that this storm had. We all knew days beforehand that it would impact us and gave us some forewarning and time to prepare. So today what I'd like to cover is I'd like to go over really 2 key pieces of the equation in emergency preparedness. One is the rental generators and then existing stationary generators, and talk to you about some of the lessons learned, maybe some suggestions on best practices, leave you with some next steps that you can take in the planning process, and conclude it with some final thoughts. Rental power. Our emergency power response consisted of procuring and coordinating 330 mobile generators. That equated to the equivalent of 405 megawatts of power to supply our customers with power. And our technicians, along with the help of our customers, laid some 850,000 feet of cable, the equivalent of 160 miles of cable. In addition to that, our equipment rental business rented hundreds of generators under 100 kW to smaller businesses and residential customers. When we talk about elements of putting together your emergency preparedness plan as far as a rental contingency goes, really need to think about some of those site-specific needs that you have. Those of you with an existing generator may have a leg up because you know exactly what those needs are. Those without, that don't have a generator backing up their facility, have a couple more items they need to consider. Number one is the location. Where are you going to place that generator set in the event of emergency? Taking into consideration the safety needs, how you're going to get power to your building. Then we also need to look at transformers. What voltage do we either need to step that emergency generator down, up or down, to accommodate the voltage of our building? Typically, most mobile generators, 480 volts. Thinking about the manpower issues as far as an electrician, the manpower to tie that in, but certainly, having somebody on call that's familiar with your site and is going to be able to do those building tie-ins for you. Cable. Again, knowing how much cable you're going to need, what length of run you're going to need, how you're going to route that cable, looking at the safety issues there as well. Your automatic transfer switch. How are you going to transfer power into your building? And what size requirements do you have there? Fuel delivery. This one is a real key issue here, and we're going to talk a lot about fuel today. But one of the things to really bear in mind is not only your initial fuel supply, but also keeping your equipment fueled throughout the duration of the event. Typically, if we use a 2 megawatt power module as an example, when that rental generator will be rolled out to your facility, it'll typically have a very minimal amount of fuel in it to keep it under the weight requirements so that it can be transported. So when that rental is rolling out to you, you need to make sure that you have a fuel supplier that's going to come out there, meet that generator, and fuel that generator up. Now, we also bear in mind, if we use that 2 meg power module as an example, that at full load, we have about 10 hours of runtime. So for those customers that ran for a week, there's a lot of refueling that needs to go on to keep power to their facilities. Looking at spare parts inventory. So once you have that rental asset on site, is looking at what consumable parts do you need to keep that running for a longer duration, as far as the way of filters or fluids. And lastly, having a maintenance plan in place, so maintaining that asset if you are going to run for an extended period of time. So some of the lessons learned here, as far as customers that fared very well in the storm versus those that did not. Certainly, those customers that had a plan in place and had figured out a lot of these elements we discussed prior fared much better. Those that had rental contingency plans with a supplier, that they would have an asset when needed if they called upon it. And first and foremost was making sure that plan was executed well in advance. Assuming it would happen, securing the equipment, starting their plan, not waiting for the last minute. So share with you a customer success story. One of our customers very close to the dealership, Robert Wood Johnson in New Brunswick. They had a very robust action plan that covered a lot of elements of the hospital. As far as supplying them, making sure if they couldn't get supplies and medicines, they would be okay for a number of days. The power piece of that equation was very important to them, and I think very important to any business out there. In today's modern world, without power, business almost ceases to exist. It's almost impossible to conduct our businesses. They had a team looking at the weather. They decided in advance, made the assumption they were going to lose their primary power source, they were going to go on their generators, and they were going to lose that second layer of redundancy they had. So they acted on their contingency plan. We rolled in two 2 meg power modules that you can see in the picture there. So it gave them that extra layer of redundancy. They did, in fact, lose power for a number of days, but their existing generators were well maintained. They didn't have a problem, but they certainly had that level of security. Another success stories, a company in New Jersey called Wakefern Food Corporation. They operate the ShopRite supermarkets in New Jersey. They had a first right of refusal contingency plan with us for 30 generator sets. Before the storm, they exercised the option on 26 of those generators. Their plan was a little different from the standpoint that they didn't really know specifically where they would be impacted, where they would have power outages, but they put the people and the resources in place that they could move those mobile generators around, move the cable around, respond to any of their businesses to make sure that they could stay operational and protect their product. So, reiterating some of the customer challenges here. One was not having a plan in place and executing it too late. We certainly had many customers with contingency plans. First right of refusal, we called those customers, offered them an emergency generator. We had many customers that didn't assume the storm would hit and didn't use that call option. I can assure you, though, that a few days later, they were calling looking for their generator. Unfortunately, they'd been given other customers, and we had to scramble to bring in generators from greater distances, which increased the response time. Not knowing their needs, exactly what was needed for their site to make sure that they could tie in emergency power, and then trouble securing manpower. Those that didn't have alliances with electricians or suppliers. In the end, we're left scrambling, and the demand was so high, it was almost impossible to respond to everybody. Equipment and cable shortages were certainly a big challenge, and I would say cable was even a bigger challenge than the equipment side. All up and down the East Coast, there was cable shortages. Certainly fuel supply issues was a challenge as well. As the storm hit, many of our refineries are right along the coast. They were shut down. Gas stations didn't have power. Although they had fuel in the ground, they weren't able to pump that fuel and supply it. So fuel levels ran dangerously low. Customers ran out of fuel. And lastly, unknown vendors and unreliable equipment. Anytime there's a major event, you're going to have people that try to capitalize on that. Customers were desperate. They're bringing in equipment, unproven, untested, unreliable. So regarding some rental power recommendations, obviously, if we could all have a redundant mobile generator to back up our facility or that second layer of protection, that would be great. Economically, that may not be feasible. A really good alternative solution to that is a rental docking station. So in the event that you need an emergency generator, it can roll up. The tie-in is very simple, cuts down on the response time. You can provide power to your building. Having a contingency program with a reserved asset. This is one, not where we're talking first right of refusal, but actually where you have a unit physically located, at the dealership that is assigned to you, and when needed, you can exercise that option. Owning your own cable and having it color-coded. I think it's a really key point here, as we talked about the cable shortages. But we also talk about, I'll give you an example of a customer of Verizon Wireless, a large customer of ours. We sold cable to them last year for many of their critical sites. The advantage here is as soon as we're responding with that emergency generator, the staff on site is unrolling that cable so that when that generator arrives, they can tie right into the building. Cuts way down on your response time. Color coding it, making sure the connections are easy on the building side, the gen side. You get phase rotation correct. In an emergency situation, when there's panic ensues, it's really beneficial to have that. And the last piece of that is really rehearsing that scenario. So once you have your plan in place, do a trial run on it. See, whether that plan, if there's any missing links or any weak spots of that plan, and is it really realistic, and are you able to execute it? I'd like to move on to stationary generators. So in regards to generator maintenance, most of the failures that we've seen could be attributed in some form or another to a lack of maintenance. An emergency generator is really designed to run for the duration of a power outage, but how do we define duration? Historically in our territory, we'd never seen a customer run without power for more than 2 to 3 days. But in this event, we certainly saw customers multiple days, stretching into weeks, even months. So how can you test for reliability that your generator is going to perform for that type of outage? And how can you ensure your maintenance program is going to ensure that reliability? Some of the real customer challenges here were maybe not that dissimilar from the challenges on the rental side of the business, but certainly was getting support from service providers. The demand was so high, those service providers with limited resources just could not respond to their customers. I would say that approximately 30% of our emergency calls during the storm came from non-customers. Diesel fuel supply and quality. Again, we talked about the fuel shortages here, but also the Because of the fuel shortages, the state had lifted the ban on using home heating oil in generators. So certainly customers took advantage of that, put home heating oil in those generators. Obviously that fuel, much dirtier, had some impacts on those generators. And lastly, no on-hand spare parts. There were some customers that we just could not respond to physically because of flooding, impassable roads due to trees falling on them. And those customers, because they didn't have filters on hand or fluids on hand, experienced a shutdown that they could have corrected themselves had they planned accordingly. So some of the lessons learned about the most common failures. You know, this reoccurring theme of diesel fuel really comes up here a lot, and fuel filter fouling was the #1 cause of shutdowns we saw as a result of the storm. Due to the fuel supplies running so low, what happened was customers' fuel tanks, typically the bottom of a fuel tank, is where all your sediment and your water collects. As customers ran really low on their fuel and finally were resupplied, what happened is all that got stirred up and suspended in their fuel and ingested in the fuel system. So this was pervasive across, it didn't matter the customer size, the largest financial data centers to small customers to rental equipment. This was certainly a huge issue. Weak starting batteries or defective batteries or defective chargers. This really came on early on in the storm when those generators were called upon. A lot of failure to starts. Just not proper maintenance on the starting system side of it. Overheating. Dirty radiators, plug radiators, low coolant level. Things that didn't come out in a weekly exercising or a one-day power outage, but as these generators were really stressed and ran for a number of days, these overheat conditions resulted in shutdown. Lack of maintenance and testing. I think part of that was just some of it really obvious stuff. Filters that were many years old on the equipment, low fluid levels in the form of oil and coolant, and no real-world testing, no simulation of a real-world test or power outage. Of note are two other issues here, and one's generator end failure, and again, the stress that was put on these generators, any insulation breakdown that we had in that generator end came out in a long duration run where we had some shorted out stators, rotors. And lastly, location. I think a lot of the location issues were addressed. You post-Hurricane Katrina, I think a lot of information came out about, obviously being cognizant of where that generator is located, if it's going to be in a flood-prone area. But certainly, this still was an issue in some cases with basements or distribution gear in basements where they were flooded with salt water and lost power to that business. So some best practices I'm going to share with you now. Talking a little bit about maintenance, do what you can do yourselves from a weekly PM inspection program, and then talking about what you can rely on a service provider to do on a quarterly or annual basis. Thinking about this, I was trying to put together, for a customer, what I would tell them, or what are those critical pieces of the system. What is going to cause a shutdown if you're doing your daily or weekly inspection? What are the things to really look out for? So I finally narrowed it down to about 6 systems. Okay, and I was trying to come up with an acronym. As fate would have it, the acronym I came up with was CAT-DO's. The CAT-DO's of maintenance. And these are the 6 critical systems that I looked at, from your cooling system, air intake system, your transfer of power, either your ATS or your switchgear, diesel fuel, your oil loop system, and your starting system. So these are the 6 critical components that I see that any which of these can shut the system down. I'm going to go into a little more detail on each of those systems. Cooling system, doing a weekly check on that, is obviously making sure that radiator is clean, free of debris. There's no leaks in that radiator or any of the associated piping, plumbing, and taking a coolant analysis there, making sure the level is correct and making sure that that coolant is in the proper condition through some laboratory analysis there. The air intake system, making sure your air filters are changed at the proper interval, looking at the restriction gauge, if so equipped, to make sure there's no airflow restriction there, and then thinking about the building itself, how we intake air into the building. So looking at louvers that we may have on the air intake side, make sure those are functioning properly. Your transfer system. I'm going to spend a little bit of time here because I think this is such a critical component and often overlooked. One of the reasons for that, I think, is location-wise. I mean, sometimes we spend a lot of our time thinking about that generator set and circling around that and doing our inspections. Oftentimes, the transfer switch or the switch gear is in a different room, different location, sometimes that out of sight, out of mind. A great example of that was a customer that called us during a storm. Generator's running. There's no power in the building. Transfer switch failed to transfer. The customer didn't know the location of the transfer switch. Fortunately, we had a great profile on the customer. We knew where all their equipment is. We were able to help them out and get them to transfer the switch manually. So I think it's just important to note that you can have the most reliable generator set and an endless supply of fuel, but if you can't transfer that power to your building, you have nothing. So having a maintenance program on your automatic transfer switch is key to that. And if, for those of you that may have paralleling switchgear, again, same goes for that. It's maintaining that switchgear, making sure that it operates, engines parallel together, they can load share, they can do what needs to be done in the event of a power outage. So diesel fuel comes back to the forefront here. Number one most significant cause of shutdown in the storm. Protecting the engine mounted fuel filter, I think, is the most important key here. As engine technology has changed, the emissions levels have gotten tighter, engines are less and less tolerant of dirty fuel. The tolerances in the injection system are so tight, we need to filter that fuel really fine to avoid engine damage. So the CAT filter, for example, is 2 micron, pretty fine filter. There is certainly some diesel fuel issues now with ultra-low sulfur. Its affinity for moisture, it's some corrosive effects on the fuel system, and it's not as stable as the fuel stock of old. So protecting that engine mounted fuel filter is imperative. If we can do that, we can extend our runtime much longer. So that has to come in the form of pre-filtration. Having a fuel monitoring program in place, making sure that fuel that's in your tanks is clean and treated accordingly. But in an emergency situation, you're going to run through that fuel. You're not going to know what goes in your tank. It may be dirty fuel, so you need to think about having some redundant filtration pre-engine filter. Raycor fuel water separators, I found, is a very effective product and something that a solution we've sold to many customers to rectify fuel filter plug-in issues. The oil loop system. Again, maintaining your lube oil here, looking for any leaks in that system, any of the hoses, and SOS sampling on your oil. Great indicator of what's going on with that engine, picking up on problems early before they become costly repairs. Your starting system traditionally is the #1 cause of shutdown. It was a little different in the storm here, but this traditionally is the #1 or failure to start in generator sets. And here it's really only a load test on the batteries, test their quality. The recommendation on lead acids is really to replace them every 3 years. And on inspection here, it's really just making sure your charger's working, making sure your associated cable is fine. And this is the first chain in that cycle. Once that generator is called upon, we need that starting power. I like to use the term reliability-centered maintenance. All those of us in the power systems service industry, everything we do really speaks to reliability. All the things we test for, all the inspections that we do, we're trying to ensure reliability so that when there is a power outage, that generator is going to start and it's going to provide power for the duration of the outage. I like to use an analogy where if we just compare ourselves to a generator set. All the time we're assessing how we feel and what condition we're in. Once in a while we got to go to the expert. We got to go see a doctor. Some of us don't like to do it. I certainly don't, but it's got to be done. When you go to the doctor, you're going to get some lab work done. He's going to pull a blood sample. So similar here on the generator side. You're going to do those dailies, weeklies, assess, is there any problems? You're going to call the expert in to do a little bit more invasive, do a little bit more digging. You're going to get that lab work done, in the form of oil sample, coolant sample, fuel sample, to give you some information. Oh, hey, there's something going on here, that needs to be corrected. Some other pieces of that component, if we look at the total system, is doing some insulation testing on the generator end, making sure there's no insulation breakdown there. And then some dynamic forms of testing, like load bank testing and building load testing, addressing the total system. good analogy with load bank testing or building load testing is if you've got a car out in the garage there, and traditionally what we do with generators, we exercise them. So you go out and start that car up every week or so and let it idle for a few minutes, and then you're going to sit in it and go on an 8,000-mile road trip. I don't know if you're going to have a ton of confidence in that system. So it's really doing some dynamic real-world testing. So just touching a little bit on load bank testing. I mean, a great way, simulating a power outage, putting stress on that engine, going back to that medical analogy. This is the stress test right here, to expose some weaknesses. So that's the intent here. I mean, let's find out, are there any issues in a controlled environment before the power outage? Can we find anything wrong that needs to be repaired? It's going to verify your response time, verify your outputs, and it's also a good maintenance practice from evaporating harmful deposits from your exhaust system that get left there from exercising your genset a lot. Building load or confidence testing. I mean, this is really where we can really test dynamically a real-world scenario. Some people call it a pull-the-plug test, but essentially we're going to cut power to the building, and we're going to see how our total system works from the standpoint of response time, making sure that transfer of power happens, and making sure our equipment is running properly. So let's talk about some next steps. Planning, partner, and power. So having a written plan in place that you can put into action. So again, having an emergency preparedness plan, rehearsing that plan, identifying the elements that may be missing, and making sure you execute that plan before it's too late. Choosing the right partner. Not all of us is an expert in the way of rental power, generator maintenance, but there are people that are, and asking for help in developing your plan. Making sure you address reliability when you develop your maintenance program for your existing generator set. Get some training on your equipment. I mentioned that sometimes you have to be prepared to be in that island mode that you're not going to get support. So it's knowing your equipment, knowing some simple things that you can do to keep power supplied to your building. And lastly, it's knowing the depth and capability of your partners. And that goes for all the people that you're going to need for this preparedness plan. Your electrician, okay, your fuel supplier, your generator service provider, okay? How are they going to respond when hundreds of customers are calling them? How are you going to be important enough for them to get to you? And maybe it's going as far as looking at your partner's their own preparedness plan, okay? And what are those contingencies they have in place to address a large-scale event? I want to talk a little bit about the Cat dealer network in action here, what happened to us as far as Superstorm Sandy goes. Anytime you have a chance or an opportunity to visit a Caterpillar dealer, you can't help but be impressed by the breadth of product, the resources they have. This is my first time here personally in Milton, and it's certainly impressive to see all that. And the fact that they can pull resources from other divisions. What you don't see, though, is that dealer network that's behind it as well. And certainly for us during the storm, that was so important. We were supported by at least 15 dealers in supplying us rental equipment. We just didn't have the demand was just way higher than the inventory we had. And the support of those dealers and the rental resource center that Caterpillar has, was imperative. Also, the other dealers' willingness to supply us with manpower help. We had pulled from all our divisions, went from a level of about 32 guys to 70 guys to be able to respond. And the dealers helping us out with manpower. Milton was instrumental in that. I mean, they provided us with 10 technicians to help us out. And really, it's the people. Enough can't be said about the people. And that goes for Foley, and I'm sure it went for Milton and our neighbors, H.O. Penn and Ransom. People just, validating the business that we're in, the emergency power business. An event like this is validated. What we do is pretty darn important. And people that dealt with their own issues, their own damage, their own homes being without power, and just really stepped up to make sure that we could support our customers. So I leave you with this final thought. And this is from a quote from Max Mayfield, the director of the National Hurricane Center. He presided when Hurricane Katrina hit. Preparation through education is less costly than learning through tragedy. I commend all of you for being here today and taking the first step. I invite you to capitalize on the opportunity. At today's workshop, all the elements of emergency preparedness planning are represented at the various stations, with the experts in place for you to consult with. Start your planning today. Do not hesitate. Do not delay. Thank you.